The wind howled like a living beast across the frozen plains, sweeping fine white dust over the bones of the earth. In that merciless age, long before the memory of kings and cities, before the first spark of written word, humankind huddled beneath the shadow of glacier that devoured mountains and silenced forests. Winter was not a season then, it was an endless reign, a cold empire that ruled the world without mercy. The sun itself seemed timid, a pale ghost wandering a sky of lead. For the people of that ancient time, the cavemen who roamed the Ice Age, every dawn was a gamble between survival and extinction. Their breath rose in pale ghosts through the air, and every heartbeat was a fragile flame against the endless frost. They had no steel, no shelter of brick, no warm cities to retreat to. Yet somehow, they endured. At the heart of their survival were the shelters they built, crude, simple, yet astonishingly wise. These were no mere piles of stone, they were the last defense against a world determined to erase them. Long before the invention of civilization, instinct had guided the early humans to understand the land, to listen to the whispers of snow and stone. They learned where the wind would strike hardest, how the ice would form, where the mammoths traveled, and where warmth could still be trapped from the dying light of day. They dug into earth and mountain, hollowing the bones of the world to make homes that could cradle the living flame. A single spark of fire in those shelters was worth a kingdom, for in that spark, life itself endured. When the world turned white and silent, the people of the cold gathered in their dens like wolves. The caves were their mothers' stone wombs that gave protection when the world outside sought to devour them. The smell of smoke and tallow filled the air, thick with the musk of hides and the faint iron of blood. Children slept curled against their mothers beneath layers of fur, while men returned from the hunt with frost clinging to their beards, their eyes glazed from the killing wind. In the far corner of the shelter, embers glowed in a circle of stones, their orange light licking the walls, casting trembling shadows that looked like ancient spirits dancing upon the rock. Those shelters, carved by hands both calloused and clever, were more than walls, they were prayers made solid, a promise that tomorrow might still come. The early humans learned to seal their entrances with mammoth hides, to block the biting wind. They laid animal bones into their walls to strengthen the frame, layering branches and snow to trap heat like a mother's embrace. Even the shape of the shelter mattered, round like the curve of the earth, for the circle held warmth better than corners. They studied the wisdom of the wolf's den, the bear's hibernation hollow, and mimicked nature's architecture. Each home became a living thing, breathing warmth, whispering safety, echoing with the faint pulse of a tribe that refused to die. The shelters became symbols of their defiance, proof that though the earth was cruel, the human spirit was more cunning still. Outside, the snow fell endlessly, swallowing the horizon, turning the world into a white grave. The trees bent beneath its weight, the rivers froze in silence, and even the stars seemed farther away. Yet within the cave, life continued. The rhythmic sound of a child's breathing mixed with the crackle of fire. Sparks rose like tiny suns and vanished in the dark. An elder, his hair silver with frost, traced stories on the wall with charred sticks of hunts, of spirits, of warmth found in impossible places. His voice was low and broken, but the children listened, eyes wide, for in his words burned the memory of how to live. The shelter was not only their body's protection, it was the keeper of their knowledge, the cradle of language, of myth, of memory. Sometimes the wind would find a weakness in the wall, a gap between hide and stone, and the fire would flicker as if gasping for air. The tribe would move as one, sealing the breach with packed snow, tightening the leather, murmuring words that were half ritual, half hope. Every movement mattered. Every act of warmth was sacred. In that ancient silence, the difference between life and death was measured in the distance between a flame and a breath. When the fire dimmed, eyes turned to the smallest sparks as if to plead, live, burn, stay. For if the flame died, so too would they. Days and nights blended together under the rule of frost. Outside, the predators roamed, saber-toothed cats, dire wolves, shadowed shapes whose hunger matched that of the humans inside. But within their shelters, the people discovered something miraculous, that together, their warmth multiplied. A single body gave off enough heat to soften the air, 10 bodies could make the cave breathe with life. They learned to sleep close, pressed shoulder to shoulder, skin to fur to skin, until the cold retreated from their shared breath. The Ice Age had taught them a secret older than language, that survival was not strength alone, but closeness. Their shelters became temples of togetherness, each heartbeat a small rebellion against the frozen gods outside. And so, beneath miles of snow and years of endless winter, the cavemen endured. Their shelters stood like forgotten fortresses, made not of pride, but of necessity, not of beauty, but of truth. They were built by hands that trembled, by hearts that feared, yet still refused to surrender. In those dark wombs of stone, humankind learned its first great lesson, that to survive is to create. Each cave, each hut of bone and hide, was a declaration that life would not yield to the dark. The shelters kept them alive, but more than that, they taught them what it meant to be human. For within those small pockets of warmth, the first dreams of the future began to flicker, faint as a spark in the endless snow. As the winters deepened and centuries turned like slow grinding stones, the cavemen began to shape their world with intention. What began as desperate burrows became deliberate craft. Survival no longer depended on chance alone but on wisdom, inherited through memory and hands. Each generation studied the ways of snow, of ice, of bone, and learned to bend nature's cruelty into something that could serve them. They became the builders of warmth, architects born not from luxury but from hunger, fear, and awe. In their crude shelters lay the first blueprints of human intelligence, the earliest whispers of design that would, one day, build cities of steel and glass. But back then, beneath the aurora and frost, the architects wore skins of beasts and carried fire in their eyes. The bones of mammoths became their scaffolds. Their tusks, curved and mighty, were set into the ground as frames for huts, draped in hides stitched with sinew. Every piece of material was sacred. A single rib could become a roof beam, the hide of a reindeer became both blanket and wall. The cavemen learned to layer furs, trap air within fibers, and create an invisible barrier against the howling cold. They studied how snow itself could insulate, not destroy, and began to pile it around their huts, sealing in warmth. To modern eyes, their shelters might seem fragile and primitive, but to them, they were marvels of engineering. In the heart of an ice age where even fire trembled to stay alive, these shelters were miracles. They did not merely stand against the storm, they became one with it. Inside these shelters, life transformed. The tribes learned to make fire more than a fleeting gift. They learned to feed it, to tame it, to shape their homes around its breath. The fire pit became the center of their world, the axis around which everything revolved. Above it, they began to build small vents from stones and hollow bones, guiding the smoke upward, allowing air to move without stealing their heat. This was not yet architecture as we know it, but it was its first heartbeat. They understood that a living space needed balance, warmth, air, and shelter all in harmony. The flame needed to live, just as they did. And so, they began to speak to it through gestures, murmurs, and ritual as though it were a spirit watching over them. In many ways, it was. Beyond warmth, these shelters became the heart of their society. Here, in the flickering light of fire and shadow, the first communities took shape. Men, women, and children gathered not only to eat but to think, to share, to remember. The walls became storytellers. On them, with soot and ochre, they painted the hunts, the animals, the heavens. These images were not decorations but memories etched into stone, maps for survival, prayers for return, symbols of belonging. The shelter was both body and soul, both shield and storyteller. Every mark upon its wall was a declaration: we were here. We lived. The shelters also changed the rhythm of their days. When the storms outside raged for weeks without pause, the people learned patience. They used their confinement to craft tools from bone and stone, sharper, stronger, more precise. They built needles from fish bones to stitch tighter hides, invented crude lamps from fat and moss, and carved patterns into the bones of animals, giving beauty to survival. The idea of home began to take root in their blood. Not just a place to hide from death, but a space to dream, to build, to love. It was within these tight circles of firelight that language grew thicker, that laughter found a voice, that children learned to mimic the sounds of their parents. Each word was a spark, a fragment of warmth in the long dark. But the world outside was never merciful. Entire tribes vanished when blizzards buried the valleys. Hunters who strayed too far from the shelters became statues of ice before sunrise. The Ice Age showed no pity. And yet, those who survived learned. Each disaster carved wisdom into their bones. They began to choose their shelter sites with more cunning, near cliffs to block the wind, near rivers for melted snow, near forests for fuel. They read the land as one might read the veins of a hand, and their shelters became living maps of instinct and intelligence. Slowly, their mastery over nature's chaos grew. In the battle between man and frost, the scales began to tip not through strength, but through understanding. There were moments, though, when even their wisdom was not enough. During the longest winter, when the snow fell for so many moons that even the sky seemed buried, some tribes faced the edge of extinction. The cold pierced through hides and walls alike. Fires died. Children slept and never woke. And yet, from those moments of despair came new invention. The people began to dig deeper into the earth itself. They found that below the frozen crust, warmth still lived. The ground held the memory of the sun, faint but real. They carved tunnels and chambers underground, lining them with stone and clay, sealing the entrance with snow and hides. The air was heavy, but warm. For the first time, humans discovered that safety could come from below, from the embrace of the earth rather than the mercy of the sky. These early underground shelters were the ancestors of the homes and hearths that would one day dot the world. Inside one such shelter, a mother nursed her child beside the fire. The light danced across her face, fierce, determined, soft all at once. Around her, the others slept or sharpened tools, their breath fogging in the dim glow. The walls were painted with handprints, red, black, ochre, a forest of ghosts. Outside, the wind screamed like a spirit denied its prey, but inside, there was peace. The cave smelled of smoke and life. The child's tiny hand reached toward the flame, fingers outstretched, and for a heartbeat, time itself seemed to hold its breath. That spark, that fragile defiance, was humanity itself. And so, across millennia, the cavemen continued to build, to adapt, to outthink the cold. Their shelters evolved from instinct to art, from survival to expression. What began as a hole in the earth became a heartbeat of culture, of thought, of hope. The shelters kept them alive, but more than that, they gave them the space to become human. Within their walls, humankind's first dreams stirred, dreams not of survival, but of future. There came a time when the shelters of stone and bone were no longer just defenses against the cold, they became temples of memory, shrines of the spirit. As generations passed, the cavemen began to see their homes not merely as places of refuge, but as living beings that carried the essence of their ancestors. Each crack in the rock, each burn mark from fire, each handprint upon the wall told a story older than words. Within these shelters, humanity began to sense something greater, the unseen rhythm of life and death, the mystery of existence itself. The cave was not just a structure, it was the first cathedral, where the ceiling was the sky's echo and the walls were the skin of the earth. And in those dim-lit chambers, lit by trembling firelight, the seeds of belief and perhaps of civilization took root. In the deepest chambers, where the cold could not reach, the people painted. They crushed minerals, mixed them with animal fat, and blew pigment through hollow bones. The images that bloomed on the stone were not idle decorations, they were living prayers. Bison, mammoth, reindeer, and bear danced across the rock faces, shimmering in the flicker of firelight, appearing to move as if alive. To paint was to summon, to remember, to speak to something vast and invisible. When the hunters looked upon the walls before setting out, they did not see mere art, they saw the spirits of their prey, the guardians of their fate. The shelter had become an interface between the human and the divine, a threshold between the mortal struggle and the eternal mystery. These early people believed that the spirits of those who had died did not vanish but lingered within the stone. The shelters became places where the living could commune with the dead, where echoes of their ancestors whispered through the cracks and shadows. When someone died, their bones were sometimes placed in hidden corners of the cave, wrapped in furs and marked with ochre. The living would return to those places, touching the stones, murmuring words of remembrance, as though to keep the bond unbroken. This was the dawn of ritual, the first time humankind looked at death not with surrender, but with understanding. Their shelters were no longer only for the body, they had become sanctuaries for the soul. Outside, The Ice Age still reigned with unrelenting ferocity. The glacier advanced and retreated like the breath of some colossal sleeping god. The tribes moved with the seasons, chasing herds, crossing valleys glazed with frost. But wherever they went, they carried their knowledge of shelter, of warmth, of worship. Some built huts from stone slabs and sod, others hollowed out the earth, carving sanctuaries beneath it. And wherever they settled, they brought the sacred fire, the symbol of life eternal. The fire was not simply heat, it was holiness. Each shelter that held it was a temple, each spark a fragment of the sun they could not touch. The people believed the flame had a soul, that if treated with respect, it would guard them against the demons of cold and night. Over time, as the shelters grew more complex, so too did the lives within them. The walls became witnesses to birth, love, loss, and triumph. Mothers sang lullabies while grinding pigments for murals. Hunters mended spears beside sleeping children. Elders told stories of the stars, tracing constellations on the ceiling with fingers blackened by soot. These stories were not mere entertainment, they were education, prophecy, and faith. The cave, once a mute shelter, had become a repository of all that made them human. Every echo that returned from its depths carried the sound of continuity, of one generation speaking softly to the next. There were times when storms raged so violently that even the earth seemed to groan beneath their force. 4 days, sometimes weeks, no one could leave the shelter. Food dwindled, tempers flared, and fear crept into every heart. Yet even then, the cave stood firm, like a guardian watching over its people. In those claustrophobic nights, they discovered something else, the power of togetherness. They learned to listen, to share, to comfort. The flame, reflected in their eyes, became a mirror of unity. In their smallest shelters, they discovered the vastness of their shared humanity. The cold outside had forged something indestructible within. Among the tribes, stories began to circulate of spirits that lived in the mountains, great beings of ice and fire that controlled the seasons. The shelters became places of offering. Bones were arranged in patterns, fires lit at dawn, songs sung into the stone. The people began to believe that if they honored their homes, their sacred caves and huts, the earth itself would protect them. It was the earliest form of faith, not worship of gods in the sky, but of the very walls that held them. The shelter was their first altar, and through it, they found the first meaning of belonging. One winter, so fierce that even the rivers froze to silence, an old shaman of the tribe, her hair white as bone, her eyes dim but burning with knowledge, stood before the fire and spoke. Her voice trembled like wind through reeds. "The cave remembers," she said. "It remembers our warmth, our laughter, our sorrow. It keeps us alive not only in body, but in spirit. When we are gone, our breath will stay here in the walls, in the smoke, in the flame." The tribe listened in reverence, for they knew she spoke truth. The shelter was more than protection, it was memory itself. The moment she died, they marked the cave with her handprint in red, not to mourn, but to declare that she remained, forever woven into the stone. In the centuries that followed, those sacred shelters became monuments. When tribes returned to abandoned caves, they found the marks of their ancestors still there, the prints, the symbols, the ashes of old fires. They would kneel and touch them as one might touch the face of a lost parent. Those marks told them they were not alone in time. The shelters had carried their lineage forward through ice and extinction, preserving not just bodies but meaning. And so, as the Ice Age began its slow retreat and the earth softened, the cavemen emerged from their shelters as something more than survivors. They were storytellers, dreamers, thinkers. The walls that had once kept them alive had also shaped their souls. Within the darkness of those prehistoric sanctuaries, humanity found light not just from fire, but from the awakening of thought, of reverence, of hope. The shelters had saved their bodies, yes, but far more profoundly, they had awakened their spirits.